Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Sanjeev Singha. We welcome you all to the second annual DC South Asian Literary Festival, which is being held from April 16 to 24, 2022. It is an exciting week full of book discussions, workshops, and conversations. Please remember to register at dcsaaci, dcsaaci.org. Today's conversation is about the book Love's Garden by author, Professor Nandini Bhattacharya, and the moderator for the session is Betty Joseph. Betty Joseph is an English-American literary critic and professor of English at Rice University, Houston. Born in Kerala, she received her BA from Sophia College, Mumbai, and an MA from JNU, New Delhi. On moving to the US, she attended graduate school at the University of Minnesota. She has published 2 books and numerous essays on a wide range of topics relating to Indian writing in English and British literature. Here is Betty.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you, Sanjeev. Welcome everyone to the book spotlight with Nandani Bhattacharya. I have known Nandini for many years and I was very delighted to get a chance to talk with her about her book. And it was a bit of speed reading because it's the end of the semester and you have to kind of find the time to do it. But it is such an amazing book. And I was telling Nandini that I wish I had kept it for the summer to really relish it because there is so much in there that I think we will get to talk about today. So I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing Nandini, and then we will take about 50 minutes where she will read sections from the book, and then we will have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes at the end of the hour for the audience to pose questions. And I imagine that we could probably put, I don't know what Sanjeev hasn't let me know what the instructions are, but I do see the raise hand feature, or maybe you can put questions in the chat. So I don't know how that is to be done, but we'll come to that anyway. So without taking up any more time, I'm going to say a quick word about Nandini Bhattacharya. Is a writer, professor of English, and a public intellectual. Her fields of expertise are South Asian studies, Indian cinema, post-colonial studies, and colonial discourse analysis. And all that historical work is really reflected so well in this beautiful novel. So you'll see that when she starts reading from this. She is also a faculty member in women's studies, and now more recently, a really fine creative writer. She has published 3 scholarly books, the latest being Hindi Cinema. This is the title of the book, Hindi Cinema, Repeating the Subject, that was published from Routledge University Press in 2012. And her novel, which she will be reading from today, Love's Garden, appeared in October 2020 and has garnered praise as a fascinating journey into India's complex past. And it's also been described by reviewers as a well-crafted, sprawling family saga set against a background of some of the most momentous events of 20th century Indian history. Some of her shorter fiction has been published in really well-known venues like the Oyster River Pages and the Saturday Evening Post Best Short Stories anthology that was published in 2021, Funny Pearls, the Bombay Review, the Bangalore Review, and more. She has attended the Bread Loaf Writers Workshop, and she was accepted for residencies at the Vermont Studio Center and VONA, which is Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation. And her awards include a 2021 Pushcart Prize nomination. This is a really big deal. I was very delighted to hear about this. She was also the first runner-up for the Los Angeles Review Flash Fiction Contest in 2017, 2018. And she was longlisted for the Disquiet International Literary Prize, both in 2019 and 2020. And she received an honorable mention for the Saturday Evening Post Great American Short Story Contest in 2021. She's currently working on 2 projects. One is a scholarly monograph about how colonialism and capitalism continue to shape contemporary Indian culture. And then the second novel that she's working on is titled Homeland Blues. It is about, as she has told me, it's about love, caste, colorism, and violent religious fundamentalism in India and in the US, racism, xenophobia in post-Donald Trump era. So I'm going to start off by just asking you to just tell us how you got the inspiration to do this project. It looks like something that took many years to write. So I would be really surprised if you don't say that it took a long time to write, because it's so rich. So just start off by telling us a little bit about how you came to this, writing this book, and the themes that you chose to focus on. And then you can go right into selecting maybe 1 or 2 sections for us to read.
Oh, great. First of all, Betty, thank you for that warm, kind introduction. I feel overwhelmed just listening to what supposedly I have done. And also thanks to the organizers, to Manoj and Sanjeev and everyone else, and Snigdha for dealing with all the inevitable technological issues and so forth. So thank you and welcome to everyone who's here this afternoon, this lovely afternoon, to listen to us. Betty, the pushcart nomination only means something if you win the pushcart.
No, but it's a big deal to just get it.
It's a nice thing. It's a nice little pat on the back. As to how I got started, yes, it is a very intense and long labor of love, I would say. I kind of, I had a research leave in my younger and wasted days, and I just couldn't do any scholarship that leave. I don't know what happened. It was, transitional, maybe early midlife crisis. But at the time, these old stories that I would keep remembering that women in my family had told me, some of them I thought were very clever, very cute, some were poignant, and most of them made me wonder about the women whose anecdotal lives, great grandmothers, I was privy to have these little bits from, and I wished I knew them. I wished I could have spoken to them. I wished particularly in that moment in my state of mind, I wished I could ask them for maybe advice or guidance about what to do when things get sometimes really tough and sometimes just seem insuperable or just seem hopeless and so on. So I kind of started remembering these little stories that I was told. And members of my family, of course, had associations with some British Indian officers, or basically the bureaucracy of English officers in India, as well as the government at different ranks. So there were some stories that were always, woven together with tales about the Raj, or at least maybe true stories about the Raj. So essentially, that is my ground of inspiration for the actual material, then which of course then got transformed by fiction, as it always does, into what is probably what Aristotle would call poetic truth. It may not have happened, but it would be so great if it had happened that way, or more interesting or something. So that's how the novel got started. And yes, it took 10-15 years, because I kept laying it off. I kept saying, nah, I can't. This is not my real thing. I am a scholar and a professor, and I cannot be writing a novel. And then I wrote a novel, and someone was kind enough to publish it. So that's the story, if that,
Fantastic. Yeah, and I see all those stories, and I said they must have come from some family back, that must have come from some people in the family, because they sound like the sorts of things that you would hear, not only from relatives, but also from servants or,
Oh, yeah.
people who are kind of going through the
Distant
house, the kind
relatives.
of things that you remember from childhood. Okay, so take us into a section maybe that. you
Yeah,
want to do?
sure.
Yes.
So I'll just start at the beginning. It's always a good place to start with a story. I'm starting with the first part of the novel, which begins in a remote North Indian village in 1898. Chapter 1. In the year 1898, in a corner of Britain's far-flung empire where the imperial sun is still rampant, a train snakes through a vast plain checkered by bronze, green, and ochre fields of wheat, corn, and millet. A woman stumbles through the train, passing compartments, peering into some, trying to reach the engine at the front. Her name is Saroj, and she wants to stop the train. Stop the train. Get off. How can this be happening? Why hasn't Munia come? She promised she would come without fail. Munia knows the stakes. She swore on her honor and her love. People are sleeping, seated, slumped, stretched out, some with their entire bodies and heads covered with makeshift sheets, others in ugly positions that bring no shame, only to the utterly oblivious. The train is completely dark. Here and there, Saroj hears a moan, a whimper, even a low droning. Is that an infant crying, though? Saroj freezes for a long second. No, it's a little girl who has fallen off a bunk. She is lying sprawled on the dirty floor, sobbing as if getting up without her mother's remorseful help is out of the question. Saroj can't wait, can't stop, can't step into the compartment and help her up. No time to lose. Saroj lurches on forward. The engine shrieks again and again as it shreds the night. Saroj begins to think she will not be able to reach that engine compartment where the driver and the stoker are busy urging on the machine like a trained beast. Her legs are giving way. The spirit billows out of her like smoke from an extinguished fire. All is burning. All has burned. She should have burned too. It was her fate. But she erred. She sinned. Had she sinned? Had she erred? The old agony of that dilemma stops her as if someone has just punched her in the gut. She doesn't even try to break her fall to the floor. On the gritty floor of the snaking train, taking her away from everything she has ever known or loved, Saroj dies that night inside. In Patna, Bihar, Bengal province, a man called Manohar Mishra, who has promised to marry her, is shocked and distressed to see her being supported out of the train by 2 or 3 other passengers. There's a deep gash on her forehead where she says her fall broke when she slipped in the sewage-slick train bathroom. She looks at her husband-to-be but can't see him, just a blur, because another face glows before her eyes. When she is a little recovered with cool water and a shard of bread, she steps into the tonga Manohar Mishra has brought for her, adorned with flowers and bells. They go to his house, many miles in the interior, set deep within leagues of cracked fields and dry gullies. Here she will find love, indeed she will, even if it is her new husband's not good enough love. Her new husband is 40-ish, round and docile, practically old enough to be her father. She will throw away that love. I'm going to skip a little bit here. One day, she asks her husband if he can send someone back to her old village to look for a woman called Munia. He asks why, and she says she'd promised to take her with her when she left. Munia was her personal maid. Somehow they got separated during the flight and the night train journey to her new home. Manohar Mishra does try. He's a good man and a good husband. He wants to please his pretty young wife, to see a smile on her pale, withdrawn face. One night he tells her in how many ways he's tried. I'm more than willing to spend money if I only knew where to look. I sent 3 people to your village. They couldn't find anything. Some people said there used to be a young maidservant called Munia, but she's gone, they say. She just vanished one day, they say, right after you left. Some people even say she may be dead. Saroj listens quietly, her eyes on the floor at her husband's feet. Dead or alive, Munia, may you burn in hell. Burn, Munia, burn in hell. That's all that's left now. All is burning, all is afire. Saroj burns, in eternal hellfire herself. Can she tell anyone what she's lost with Munia? Can she? Like lightning, the thought, almost injunction, almost temptation, flashes in her head. Tell him. Tell him what you were going to tell later, begging for kindness, had Munia come. Can she confess to her husband? Can she ask him to look again, to send men to ask where and how and if Munia died? No, this man has done enough. This man has done more than enough, more than most men would do. And Saroj, she has done an unspeakable thing. Then, like a thunderbolt, a girl is born to her. She's 21. In the 2 years of marriage to Manohar Mishra, she has used every available contraceptive, Ayurvedic, folk, homeopathic, and hearsay, as well as douched and scraped herself raw after every visit from her husband. But it seems there will be no forgiveness for her. And then I'm going to read from the next section, which is, sorry, just 1 second. I need to refer to the notes I have about this. Well, I'm just going to move on actually and go to chapter 9. Now we are hearing the story of the daughter who was born to Saroj, and her name is Prem, and she got married to a very wealthy and older man in Calcutta and is in a loveless but grand marriage. Chapter 9. Sometimes in the pigeon cooing, raven crowing, sparrow chirping afternoons, quite alone, absolutely lonely, Prem thinks of her mother. When she was growing up, she'd always known the village folk whispered bad things about Maiji. Her own beloved Dai, Shampiari, probably fanned the fire of slander and scandal assiduously. There's talk everywhere in villages like that. About 200 people at most lived in Prem's village. Most of them were tenant farmers. A few were small independent farmers. There was one country allopathic doctor, 1 or 2 Ayurvedic healers, 2 homeopaths, 1 shoemaker, 3 tailors, and umpteen ostlers, several grocers and shopkeepers. There was a priest, there were monkeys ruling the temple grounds, there were servants of the big landowners' households like her father's. Rumor, therefore, was the necessary equalizer. Prem too had grown up feeling very deep inside her body her mother's untold, unnatural collapse, like red chili paste rubbed on broken skin. Maiji didn't love her. Why? She didn't know. Must be that there was something about her, something wrong. And this had to be Maiji's great misery and mystery. Prisoner of one's own unlovable, not right child. Prem didn't know as a girl if she loved Maiji either. She'd never been much around her mother. For a long time, it had scalded her that her mother didn't love her, that she was her mother's prison. So sometimes when the need to know, to touch, to hold a thing that was rightfully, undeniably hers overpowered Prem, she scratched the itch by groping and clawing through an old trunk Maiji had brought to the farmhouse as a bride. She specifically remembers as if it were yesterday what trouble that led to one afternoon 10 years ago. That old iron trunk was kept under Saroj's bed in her own bedroom where she slept alone. No one was supposed to touch it. One grumpy day, Prem had tiptoed into that practically forbidden bedroom, opened the trunk, begun ransacking, picking and moving this and that. She had hands that itched to hold, to take and keep. She picked up a photograph. It was Maiji with a baby. Of course, the baby was Prem. And this was the first picture she'd seen of herself. So she scrutinized it closely. What a sweet, sweet little baby she'd been. Such nice curly hair gathered up with a bow on one side, eyes bold with kohl, kohl smudge on her left temple to ward off the evil eye. In the picture, Maiji was even smiling. So that was possible. Prem peered more closely. Indeed, looking sideways at baby, not at the world, Maiji was actually beaming. The world had shrunk into mother-baby photo. This kind of world, the kind of world Prem had given up wishing for. But this meant that Maiji had loved her once, very much. But then something bad had happened, and Maiji stopped loving her. Things can change very quickly. What kind of mother, Prem heard Dai's voice, doesn't love her own child? She replied to Dai, a mother who, but she wouldn't remember her own formulation. There were footsteps right behind her, light-footed, quick footsteps. Maiji was right behind her. She never wore, unlike other women, piles around her ankles. And Maiji snatched the photo out of her hands, and the photo tore diagonally into halves. Prem kept most of Maiji. Prem did her best to look back at Maiji, who'd once loved her. Identical eyes, dilated in unidentical fear and rage, looked at each other. Centuries passed. The eyes, once one, had had time to separate, individuate, become windows to two different souls. Finally, Maiji said, "Why? Who said you could?" Prem dry swallowed. She tried to force back painful pricking tears. She wanted to tell Maiji the trunk was already unlocked, that her throat really hurt, like a fattening worm inside it was growing more ridges and reins. Oh, 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 oh. Give me that, Maiji said, pointing at herself in Prem's stiff fingers, and get out right now. Maiji was still speaking as she reeled back and raised her free arm in a gesture as unfamiliar as bone-chilling. Now pause there.
Thank you for that, Nandini. So, yeah, I thought we could spend a few minutes just kind of discussing these two characters.
Mhm.
I mean, these are really gripping women. I mean, considering that they don't reveal a lot about themselves. And what I think keeps this novel so gripping is that you don't tell us what's going on here, right? I mean, we begin with Saroj running through a train. There's some kind of damage that's happened, but we don't know what it is. And you really have to wait in the novel for the characters to kind of reveal it. And I just felt like there were so many secrets in this novel, but it was the secrets that in some way drive the plot. I mean, would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, so this is what in like creative writing school, we call the slow reveal.
No reveal.
The slow reveal. And one of the temptations for me as a young, or not young, a very old, but very novice creative writer, novelist, was to have the temptation to tell all, like at the very beginning. I felt like the reader needed to know, I was focused on the emotions of the characters rather than on, the kind of tenseness of the story, the tautness of the story. So I did do my best to kind of further and further push back the kind of reveals that are to happen later in the story that kind of help make sense of why Saroj and Prem have such a troubled relationship, and why the kind of girlhood trauma of feeling unloved filters down through Prem's life, and how she either deals with it in the same way or does not, or makes a different kind of resolution for herself. So yeah, I plead guilty. I have kind of held off telling what exactly happened, and I'm glad to hear that it kind of works.
No,
so far.
that's what keeps you kind of waiting for the slow reveals.
Yeah.
And these scenes that you show us where something really important happens. It can be a simple thing like discovering a photograph. And then you, as a reader, you're left wondering, is that really her in the photograph or is it somebody else, right? I mean, it's not quite clear, right? So this is an unusual relationship between this mother and this daughter. And the irony is, of course, that the daughter who's not loved is called Prem.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
Prem.
you would
yeah.
know that.
So
Yeah.
it's not the usual kind of celebrated close mother-daughter relationship. And I mean, you don't have to tell us why you did it, but it's also, I found these two characters very, very gripping in a different way because they're both young. They are from privileged backgrounds. They're both, you know, come from landed families, and they should have a certain kind of power, and they know that, but they're also powerless in some way.
Yes,
but they manage to use their situation in some really canny ways, right? They survive in
Yes.
interesting ways. Yeah.
So the reason that I think I wrote about this particular relationship is that, among other things, in general, and you and my the listeners may or may not agree with me, but I think the mother-daughter relationship always has the potential to be one of the most difficult and challenging, as well as most rewarding relationships. And it's almost like a, you know, throw of the die where it's going to fall, whether it's going to be that kind of empowering relationship, but or not, or whether there's going to be some kind of unresolvable trauma or difficulty in the mother's life or the daughter's life that will not really allow for a kind of warm, fuzzy, you know, I like the, you know, I am your best friend kind of thing. And I have certainly seen that, not necessarily in my own life, but I've seen it, and I found that dynamic extremely interesting. But also I am trying to communicate somewhat through this that the sort of generational story of women in many contexts and many societies can never be seen in isolation from patriarchal institutions within which they have to, you know, make their way or not make their way, survive or not survive. So part of my objective as the story progresses, you will see probably, is that I'm also trying to trace out here the context within which late 19th century women in India, not quite on the cusp of modernity, but sort of trying to get, and some are being thrust into it by marriage or whatever else, are really negotiating some difficult and new turns that are quite novel, actually, but also that at the same time, they are negotiating two patriarchies, the Indian and the British, of course, as a larger overarching hegemony in India. So I think that is, that's behind my decision to make these characters and their relationships somewhat fraught, if that makes sense.
So will you read some more for us?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So next thing I'm going to read is from chapter 11. And now we are going to meet another new woman who also has a fraught life and history, but I will not tell you much about what that is, but I will describe the encounter between her, Lillian Hartfield, and now Lady Mitter, or Prem Mitter. Chapter 11. One day, Prem, now Lady Mitter, slowly, heavily arrays herself in the grand drawing room where her husband has definitively said she should now hold court in the afternoons. Every day she faithfully obeys, immensely graceful and terminally wretched, until she can flee at the sound of the high tea bell. And by the way, this is taking place in the city in Calcutta, which is the kind of arch modern metropolis of British India in the early 20th century. That afternoon, unlike the other absolutely unrippled ones, the butler brings in a card. It's a simple white card made of thick velvety paper bordered by a slender golden vine. Inside, 8 reads, Madam Lillian Hartfield requests the pleasure of a meeting with Lady Mitter. Who's this Lillian Hartfield? Prem wonders. Then infers that it's the English lady etiquette teacher, Sir Noreen, that's her husband, has hired to teach her how to become Lady Mitter. Her recitation of Tennyson before him, poised and assured of thundering applause as the prima donna she used to be in the village schoolroom, had made him cringe visibly, exaggeratedly. Enough, enough, he had said, even before she had fairly warmed up to the searing crisis of Lancelot and Guinevere in that other sad lord's Le Morte d'Arthur. Barely masking his irritation, he had said, "You will need a teacher." So a teacher has been hired to teach her how to speak proper English, play the piano, dress for Calcutta high society, be the great lady that she must become, and fast. She'd almost forgotten. You will need a teacher, which she'd understood, of course, as command, as Sir Noreen's plump index finger had wagged disapproval of her manege. She hadn't said yes or no, it didn't matter. She well recognizes that she is here to follow her husband's orders. The sentimental romances had been dead, dead wrong. She shames her husband by being such a clodhopper. He said the other day that even her vernacular accent and pronunciation are, I'm sorry to say, unacceptably bumpkinish. So the teacher is a good start. Why not? She started over in so many ways. She should continue her ascent to greatness. If it's lonely in high places, it's lonely everywhere else too. She asks the butler to show in this Madam Hartfield, assuming the madam is just a fancy golden feather to ease passage. Bumpkin she may be, but this card seems pretentious. The paper looks thick and expensive, though. And then Lillian Hartfield comes into Prem's great drawing room, ablaze in broad daylight with crystal and gold chandeliers, Persian carpets with dense, throbbing hunt scenes, gleaming Italian wood and English veined marble furniture, and precious objets d'art from the world over, including, it said, an original by Sir Joshua Reynolds himself. Prem has been installed among these splendors, but Lillian Hartfield walks in as though born to the manor. Lillian Hartfield is holding a little boy by the hand. The boy seems about 3, barely reaching up to her knees. Who is this boy? Must be her son. And does he always go on visits with his mother? What about school? Prem is mildly miffed. She doesn't want to deal with children. She doesn't want to see or think about children, little boys especially. But this boy is right here, right before her, unmistakably present. She thinks in a flash, this is how a boy who wasn't found and lost or sent off to fight and die looks. This boy wears knee-length trousers of some kind of dark felt-like material, a navy sailor jacket with an embroidered anchor prominent on the left breast flap, heart beating for England surely, dark long socks or leggings and shined leather boots. It's a tiny Englishman. This boy won't have to sail away to feed his old mother. He belongs to the race that writes and rules the destiny of others. Greeting the guests haltingly in broken childish English, Prem calls for tea. Lillian Hartfield seems steady, unflapped. Sailor boy, Prem is able to see now, has his mother's blue eyes and keeps playing with his toy soldier. Hasn't said a word to his lady host. These are the famed English manners? Prem needs a fan to cool down, but she isn't used to carrying around the ivory hand fans in style among society ladies these days. She tries to toss her head back a little and thanks Lillian Hartfield for coming to teach her. Lillian Hartfield smiles at that briefly. It's a smile Prem can't understand. She also sees in that moment, English beauty is not like Indian beauty, and it's as if the sun just broke through clouds, that Lillian Hartfield is, or at least was, beautiful. At first, she'd seem pinched and drab, the usual withered English woman in India look. But now, in the light of the smile, Prem takes in Lillian Hartfield's red gold hair tied up in a soft loose pile, the elegant line of her neck, her wide set, soft blue eyes. You must wonder why I'm here, who I am, Lillian continues in that gentle, steady, musical voice. Actually, our connection is through Sir Mitta. Now Prem is abashed. This is the wife of some business partner of her husband come to pay her a polite social visit, and she imagined her to be a lowly paid teacher. Roderick, dear, say hello to Lady Mitta, my dear, Lillian says. Something unexpected unrolls fills Prem. She can only call it a sense of power, shot through and through with pity. She's intuited instantly, without doubt, what connection Lillian Hartfield has with her through Sir Norrin. Then, for just 1 second, she wants to fling away her teacup and run to her bedroom upstairs. Maybe all this is too big for her. She's only 17. Some kind of test? A test of her limits, loyalty, generosity, charity, cunning, wifeliness, modern outlook, worldliness? She understands nothing about what's crashing around inside her rib cage right now. Please tell me how much you need, Prem says calmly. Somehow stuttering English sufficient for the need of the moment is coming to her after all. Can women only have power when they don't love or when they're wealthy? But Lillian shakes her head. There, that hint of a smile again. I don't want money, Lillian says. Do all cast-off mistresses say that? Prem wonders. So that was a bit from chapter 11, and then I'll read a little bit from chapter 16, which is the last year of the Great War, 1917, and what's happening in Calcutta, in India. But we're being introduced to a character from Prem's past. His name is Jagat Pandey. In very late 1917, one evening, Jagat is hit in his trench. He's hit in the shoulder, a sharp whistling sound past his ear ends in him feeling his arm has been shoved into ice. No pain, just a bloody, rotten, numb cold. His arm has frozen and he can't move it. The blood instantly turns a patch of liquid mud around him, dense brown. The sight, seeing his blood outside his body and not even red, but rust-colored, unhinges him. Jagat doesn't know if Prem ever got the many, many letters he wrote her. Before leaving for the front, he had no idea where that was. He pressed some of his very last coins into the hands of old Shampiari because Prem told him in the velvety darkness of that one night together that if she ever had a mother, it was Shampiari. At the front, he realized he'd entered living hell. As he shivered, flattened like a sprat gasping in shallow water behind the brief, pocked barricade of mud and stones, his rifle pointed toward an enemy he couldn't see but believed in. He saw his fellows in the trenches carried away every day. He told himself he never expected her to write back, that she would likely get married and sent off to some rich man's house soon. But when the sack of mail came even to these battered, bandaged, bleary, drenched, and maggoty men who crawled through swarming mud and blood to save civilization for their great white King George V, who lived in London, he learned that hoping against hope places the last boulder against trapdoors. Still, it helped him to write to her. He wanted her to remember him, to hear the echo of his voice, especially if he died. A letter. Tomorrow, the 15th of September, I go on a cavalry attack on the enemy. It is not likely that I should return alive because a cavalry charge is a very terrible affair. Let me say, please, that you have never written back to me has not annoyed me. Don't grieve at my death either, because I shall die arms in hand, wearing the warrior's clothes. There is no happier death for a man. especially one such as me who has been fortunate enough to adore you and freedom above all else. And then another damp spotted letter goes something like this. We're in France, a very cold country. Pardon my delay. On the 19th of November, I began writing a letter and found that the ink was frozen in the inkstand. I broke the inkpot, took out the ink, melted it over the fire, and wrote the letter to you with the melted ink. The fighting is going on with great vigor, and thousands of mothers' sons perish daily. There does not seem to be any arrangement to bring the war to a decisive issue. The matter is in the hands of God. And then finally, a letter in an agony of heart-juddering panic and fury. This is not war. This is the ending of the world. This is just such a war as was related in the Mahabharata about our forefathers. We die protecting your honor and the honor of all our cherished womenfolk. I will spare you the details of the trenches in which we lie like rabbits with feet tied, waiting for death. The shells pour in like monsoon rain. The corpses cover the country like sheaves of harvested corn. Pause there.
Great. So I just say one word about that the first section that you read, where there is this shocking revelation. And I love that scene because what you expect is, as you describe, a young girl, new bride, has just discovered that her husband actually has a mistress and a child. And yet that encounter is unexpected in the way it turns out. And you also realize this country bumpkin girl is really sharp. She figures it out even quicker than the reader does, what the situation is. And then what the novel then shows is how this girl has the power over this woman who might be Angrezi and thing, but does not have the kind of class power that she has. So I thought it was really, really interesting how you kind of switch the roles, this young girl against this older, experienced, woman of the world and Angrezi, and how she just kind of, controls that situation. So I'll leave that aside. But what I wanted to ask you as a general kind of question about the novel is the second part deals with the First World War, right? Mm-hmm. And you bring in these really interesting, incidents that maybe people don't know really how many Indian soldiers fought in both the First and the Second War. I mean, Second World War, we kind of knew, First World War. So what are the challenges that I think you handled really well in this novel is bringing in the kind of historical material in a way that's not boring, but is kind of, and you take the characters into it, a bit like Forrest Gump, but not the same way. It becomes part of their lives. So tell us a little bit about why you felt it was important to bring real historical material into the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of a bit like a documentary principle, but I actually read some of the letters of World War I Indian soldiers. And in fact, I think there were, I want to say 2 million Indian soldiers who actually fought for the Allies in the war and came back to absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was no support, there was no redress, there was no money, there were no jobs. They were basically sent back to die or do the best they could. And Jagat Pandey ends up doing okay for himself, more than okay. But the cards were not stacked in his favor. The deck was not stacked in his favor. And so what I did do is I read those letters, and I really wanted to give a sense of how British colonialism was so extractive, so exploitative, and so absolutely unapologetic about it. And so I kind of brought in this a young village man who, like many other, and there was another passage in the novel where I say, the men go and then the cattle go. Like there were, I don't know how many millions of heads of cattle that were sent from North and Northwest India to the war. So I just wanted to help the reader understand the pathos of the time, the crisis also of Indian masculinity. I mean, the not only having been ruled and trampled on for 200, 300 years, but again serving in the British Army after the British had blown off soldiers from the cannon's mouth in 1857. It's like this like repeated cycle of just having to go back to the oppressor, to the master, and kind of serve as, the slave again and again. I think, have a soft corner for romantic men who can never quite, do the macho act, which Jagat Pandey never can. And then that's the angle for the kind of unfinished, but I think one of the more powerful love stories in the novel. Now I've given it away, but yeah, so there is this angle. Reading the archival materials was extremely important and useful for a historical fiction writer. And I really would recommend that anyone who writes a historical novel always tries to do some archival research before. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, the letters felt like, they were real in some way.
I did draw upon them. Of course, I didn't copy them, but I drew upon a lot of the imagery and the emotions, and just the feeling of like apocalypse. And of course, we all know now from, a lot of films about World War I, what a dreadful butchery it was. And so I was trying to show the Indian side of it as well.
So we are at 5:45. So I was wondering if you want to do one final short reading, and then we can ask the audience if they have any questions or comments, and they can post them in the chat. And if we have extra time, then we can come back again.
I think that's a great idea. So I'm going to have to sort of abandon a few things that I had wanted to read from. But you know what? Having talked about the First War, I think I'm just going to end reading about the part in the novel about 20 years later in the lifeline and time of Prem and other characters in the novel that brings us to the Second World War. And I'm going to read to you about a sort of secondary character in the novel. He is a Japanese-American soldier in India who's fighting on what was known as the Eastern Theater of War, highly neglected, very under-resourced area, but heroic deeds. There were Americans there. There were actually Aggies in that battalion that I've put my character in. But so I wanted to show the end sort of times of the story, which is ending with another war. It goes beyond the war, but it goes through the war. So this is World War II, and the year is 1942. And this particular part starts with an epigraph, Dulce est decorum est pro patria mori, which is the famous lines from Horace about it is so sweet and it is so right to die for one's country. So chapter 54. Yellow isn't a great color in this year, 1942. This is clear to Amherst Ishuru Buck, so-called American hero of the forgotten army of the Allies. Sergeant Buck does not want to die a hero's death. He's watched friends and fellows die those. In the Burmese forest, to distract himself, he invents whole fantasy futures with girls he's never met, girls who probably wouldn't choose him anyway. It's always been like that with him. He's always looked different, neither this nor that. But when shelling starts in the forests of Nupumga, which is in Burma, and there's nowhere to go from that impossible bluff of mountain, his company, the 2nd Battalion of the Marauders, has already been there 5 days. His heart begins to turn to ash, thinking he'll never be with a girl again at all. The Japanese are all around, shelling constantly, heavy casualties, words that sound just like words until they happen around you. Never, too, is a word like a bullet with the range of infinity. What can it possibly mean? The 2nd Battalion's perimeter, 400 by 250 yards on top of a 2,800-foot high saddle of ground that dominates the surrounding terrain, is filling with shit and gangrene. At night, the forest smells like the collective fear and rage of the men marooned on the bluff. That smell will never leave Amherst fully. Also, the smell of agony, longing, and vomit. The men sleep and wake fitfully or not at all. Their suffering feels like airlessness rather than pain. Then the Japs capture the waterhole. Then Amherst and a few others like him, yellow men, Americans with Asian mixed in, start to be sent out at dead of night to try and bring back water. The second time, Amherst's mate Sterling gets shot down. He has to leave Sterling, father's name Tanaka, mother American, old San Francisco family. At the waterhole, he just barely gets back himself. They don't talk about death or about relief or about home or about girls, apple pie or football games by silent pact. Among the many pacts that men fighting and dying together make with one another, they can no longer bear it, but there's nothing they can do. They have to bear it. They bear it. On the 9th morning, Amherst is keeping track of the days for no reason he can name. Robbie Mook points his index finger upward at the sky. Deakins, with a foot already turning a mottled marbled maroon from where he stepped on some shrapnel 2 days ago, groans and rubs his eyes. Amherst will remember as if it's a movie he watched. No, the sun is barely visible through the trees above. Bits and pieces of a leaden sky can be seen. They've run out of water 2 days ago. The water hole is in the crosshairs of the Japanese, a few hundred feet away and below. And even if you slither to it like a worm, you risk getting a nice thwacking bullet in your noggin as you try to dip your makeshift water bag into the stinking crusted water. Sterling and his maggots are keeping guard at the approach. Case in point, his body probably is still there. Has Sterling's blood mixed with the hole's water? Probably. And then Robbie says, "Look, fellas, look." He tries to buck upward, but can't. Keeps pointing up, though, as though he's giving the sky the wrong finger. "Oh, pipe down, would ya?" Someone a few bodies away grunts, and then the water bags start dropping. And I'm going to skip a little bit and go to Amherst now having gone back to Calcutta. He's been released from the front and he's gone back. He's unwounded, but obviously traumatized. He has to live. He must move. Standing before the dressing mirror in his bare billet on Lansdowne Road, he runs his hand through his coarse hair. An old nervous gesture. He's going out. His hair used to be light brown, a nothing color like his skin. In school, he pulled it back with a comb and put a good bit of his mother's pomatum on it so he'd have a wider, broader forehead, look more Anglo, nice, normal. He has his mother's slanting, almost black eyes, but his face is longer and leaner, like his father's. He's not a pretty sight. There are violet hollows under his eyes. His Adam's apple pokes out alarmingly. He also needs a shave because he is alive. When you're alive, hair grows, nails too. He clips his nails. What about Sterling? Still lying there on that alien soil? Is it sunny? Rotting down to bone? Didn't someone say once that hair and nails grow even on corpses for a while? Why didn't they pick Sterling up when they left? He should have asked. He should have insisted. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nandini. Will you take a couple of questions?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Alvina Brugman has 2 questions, and I'll tell you the second one first because it's it's a longer question. Can you talk a little bit about, can you say more about how you revised and edited your novel? What stages did your novel go through over the decade that you prepared it? And how did you move from stage to stage? And the second question, which may be part of this answer, is how do you do archival research? Yeah.
Let me answer the first question first. So because I am an academic, as Betty has already told you, I am very well trained to do archival research. I've done it for my academic books. I've gone to archives in India and England and a couple other places to work on basically colonial discourse analysis, as well as some of the film work that I have published in the last scholarly book. So I do academic work by sometimes, well, in the old days, you'd actually have to write to the librarians and say, what do you have? They had some rudimentary archives online, but now everything is pretty much online, and you can look up an archive where you suspect there may be something. The War Office, the India, what is now, I think, still called this India Office in London. I forget.
India Office Records.
Yeah. And various other things, archives in Delhi. You can write to people and say, I'm coming, blah, blah, blah. But you can also look up the holdings fairly extensively before you go. In terms of the stages of writing, as I said, the first stage of writing was despair. And what else am I going to do? But that was a good stage because it really kind of catapulted me into kind of emotional intensity. So I'm a writer who thinks that I have to start with emotions. I don't have a story necessarily. I have some characters. I have a world. And I have some strong emotions. And so that is how I started. I kind of started with characters like the ones I kind of drew from my own family history. And I identified with them or disidentified with them. I created heroes and villains. I shamelessly drew from living members of the family and, disguised them into various likable or not very likable characters in the novel. And I created a world. After creating the world, the next stage, a few years later, probably was finding some kind of a story structure. Like, so what are these characters doing and what do they actually do? And how do they get from point A to point B in place and in time as they, as I tell my story about them? So I did that. And then it was just a kind of family drama, like this sort of intergenerational, actually, a professor at a workshop I attended as a creative writer was very funny. He said, oh, you're writing one of those intergenerational family sagas. Oh, that's going to sell well. Those do well. Well, it wasn't quite the case, but so I was doing that and then I got tired of it. It was like, okay, another story about mothers, daughters, just within the private realm. How many more do we need? So that is actually the moment when I started thinking, well, what was happening outside? And, what were the public realities? What was the public context of these families and these private life stories? And that's when I thought I want to hook them to wars. Because there were two very big wars, because of Indian independence movements, I thought the political context has to be brought to the foreground. And then last but not least, sometimes you read a book, another novel. So I read, I'm going to forget his name now, but the novel was called The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is by an Australian novelist who is, I think, fabulous, and wrote a novel about Australian and other POWs in Thailand and Burma during exactly this time that I'm talking about with Amherst Buck. A different area, but the same Eastern theater of war. And that novel just absolutely inspired. It electrified and inspired me in reading how one can write about the horrors of war and yet write a personal story that is imbricated with the larger global horror of war. And I kind of drew from him a good bit this idea that I really want to bring in war inside and war outside, or I want to connect them both and show that many a times wars outside really happen because of wars inside. It's all very private and petty and dynastic, and then bingo, millions of men dead. So that's kind of, I think, was my process, if that helps.
So we have reached the end of the hour. Is that when we are supposed to stop? Yes. Yes. Sanjeev, I don't know. Is it,
Yeah, well,
is it time
yes,
for
I'm
us
here.
to
Can you
stop?
hear
Yes.
me? Yeah, I was amazed to hear how it went from starting with horrors of poverty when you started that to the description of war, or like terrifying. But it was a wonderful conversation, very both emotional and intellectual.
Thank you.
So, but on behalf of Sachi, I thank you all for taking the time for the discussion. Thank you for all the attendings. Namaste, goodbye. And please don't forget to register for other events through the week. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Sanjeev.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, participants. Yeah.